Welcome back to Proverbs. We're going to finish up by looking at the last chapter in Proverbs, Proverbs 31, the wisdom of the Proverbs 31 woman. So here's the structure. It begins with the introduction, verses 1 to 7 in chapter 1, where we learn that the theme of Proverbs is godly wisdom for living, and that is communicated through 15 fatherly admonitions in that first section, and then the individual terse proverbs. Sometimes they're comparisons, sometimes they're contrasts in the next section. And you have the 30 words of the wise men. You have the Proverbs of Solomon collected by Hezekiah, as we have mentioned, to aid his reform. So you have a lot of emphasis on following the king and kings being godly. You have the words of Agur in this unique genre of Proverbs, the numeric Proverbs. He talks about 3 things and then 4. And we don't know anything about Agur. And so that's going to be true of the last chapter, the words of King Lemuel. We don't know who King Lemuel is. There's been speculation that King Lemuel is is like a pen name for Solomon, but that cannot be concluded, I don't think, convincingly. Jewish authors believe that King Lemuel was Solomon. But again, you have other authors today like John Phillips who would take that view, but most Bible teachers do not. So we're looking at wisdom. Wisdom is personified as a godly woman, as we have seen. In Proverbs 31, the virtuous woman is godly wisdom in the flesh. So just as foolishness was bound up in the adulterous woman, we see that wisdom is relational, it is social, and these personifications show that. But in Proverbs 31, though a minority would hold that this is another example of personification, most do not believe that. What you have in Proverbs 31 is the advice of the mother, the wise mother of King Lemuel. And so you have what is in contrast here. The advice usually comes from the father, as we've seen, 15 fatherly admonitions to the person he addresses as my son. But here the advice comes from the mother, Proverbs 31:1. The words of King Lemuel, the prophecy that his mother taught him. Then you have her example in Proverbs 31:10 to 31. Her advice. So let's look at this first. So the content is different in chapter 31, 1 to 9. But then when you get to verse 10, again, I think you have a content change. Chapter 31, verse 10, who can find a virtuous woman? But you also have not just a content change, but you have, again, another change in the way it was written, the literary style. The last verses from 10 to 31 is an acrostic. So each verse begins with one of the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. So that's another reason why we know we have one part in chapter 31, 1 to 9, and then the second part in verses 10 and following. You have content, and then you have just a whole new genre. So her advice, pursue purity. And first of all, she lays down her right to be heard. Verse 2, what my son, and what the son of my womb, and what the son of my vow. So I gave birth to you, okay? So listen to me. But then she calls him the son of my vows. Maybe this is sort of like Hannah, who vowed if God gave her a man-child, specifically she wanted a man-child, so that she could dedicate him to serve the Lord in the temple all the days of his life. And that's what she did. Just as soon as she had weaned him, he went to the temple, which was very unusual. Usually the priest started at about age 30. But the woman here, the mother of King Lemuel, is establishing her right to be heard. Solomon dedicated 3 fatherly admonitions to warning, just as this mother here, the mother of King Lemuel, is issuing warnings. But we know that Solomon disobeyed. Here's what Bruce Walke says in his commentary on Genesis. David's lust for Bathsheba made him callous toward justice and cost Uriah his life. That's an interesting idea there. We know the sins of David: adultery, murder, deceit, covered his sin for 9 months. But it calloused him towards justice. And we read on, and Solomon's many sexual partners made him callous toward pure and undefiled religion. David departed from morality, Solomon departed from truth. And so you see the importance of heeding these warnings in his last sentence. In other words, obsession with women has the same effect as obsession with liquor. And the mother here gives warnings in those 2 areas. Avoid drunkenness, she says, beginning in verse 4. And if we go back to Solomon and his wasted years that he describes in Ecclesiastes 2, 1-11, we know that Solomon disobeyed his godly mother's advice with wine, with women. That's in Ecclesiastes 2. Well, here the mother Lemuel is warning against that. Maybe she has Solomon and his life in mind. But then the third part of this first section is treat the poor fairly. Verse 8, open your mouth for the dumb in the cause of all such as are appointed to destruction. Open your mouth, judge righteously, and plead the cause of the poor and the needy. So there is this big theme in Scripture of biblical justice. We hear a whole lot about social justice today, social justice warriors. We're sort of turned off to that because of the abuses. But there is a biblical justice. And Tim Keller here has a good book. You're not going to agree with everything that he says here, but he talks about generous justice, or the biblical justice, where in the Old Testament there is this, just like we just read, God's people are to take care of the poor, the widows, the orphans, the refugees that come in from other countries who are fleeing from persecution. And so there is a biblical justice. And we are called to practice biblical justice. That's not to overcome our ministry so that is primary. What's primary for the church today is the Great Commission. But sometimes we can practice social justice, biblical justice, in order to win people, in order to make disciples. But it should not become primary. And then she really emphasizes avoid drunkenness. Leaders should not drink so they do not forget, she says in verses 4 and 5. Verse 4, it is not for kings, O Lemuel, it is not for kings to drink wine, nor for princes to become drunk, because it will cloud their judgment. But then she says, this is the controversial part. I guess both parts are controversial. Leaders should give drink to the suffering so they will forget. Verse 6, give strong drink unto him that is ready to perish, and wine unto them that are of a heavy heart. So here you have so many different views. And I'm not going to read through all of these, but here's one view from Kathleen Farmer. And I'm just summarizing the views at the bottom as we go through these. Alcohol may be used for medicinal purposes. The issue of abstinence or moderation is not addressed. That's probably the conclusion of all these authors that we look at. We need to go to the New Testament to defend abstinence or moderation. But she says wine can be used as a sedative or as a painkiller. And then this is the view of Thomas Constable, who quotes Warren Wiersbe, who says, I think verses 6 and 7 are spoken in irony, not as a command, because nobody's problems are solved by forgetting them. And who wants to spend his or her last minutes on life on earth drunk? So Thomas Constable quotes that view as representing his, and so here's the summary. Alcohol cannot be used to solve problems. The issue of abstinence and moderation is not addressed. So these men would not say you can't, when someone is dying, you cannot give them morphine in their last minutes. But they're just saying this was not the point of Proverbs 31, 6 and 7. This is a view of John Kitchen. In the days before medical advances we enjoy, it had some medicinal value. So we know that. 1 Timothy 3:5-23, Paul said to Timothy, take a little wine for your stomach's sake, for medicinal purposes. Those in position of leadership do not have the liberties of those with lesser responsibilities. They may end up drinking themselves silly. They, not the leaders, may end up drinking themselves sillies, but the leader cannot. It's an interesting point there. For example, John Piper changed the constitution of his church so that before no person could be a member of his church who drank. Total abstinence was the requirement for church membership in the church covenant. He later changed that requirement to apply only to the leadership. Sort of reflects what John Kitchen here is saying about this Old Testament passage. Kitchen says, these two verses should not be used as an authorization for drunkenness to avoid responsibilities and problems, but as a backhanded way of underscoring the responsibility one placed in leadership. Alcohol may be used for medicinal purposes, just like modern day medicines. Peter Stevenson's, I mentioned Peter Stevenson's, who taught at Bob Jones University. His view is alcohol may be used for medicinal purposes and even emotional issues. That would be sort of comparable to medicine for anxiety. This is Temper Longman III. You can read that. He just flat out advocates moderation, which we know is a common view among evangelicals. This is Bruce Waltke. Again, he is saying this is not addressing drinking per se, as it is just saying to leaders, you should not be given to drink. It will cloud your leadership ability. Alcohol used for medicinal purposes or even emotional issues is not advocated. And he would say that is not the issue here. This is Dwayne Garrett. The Queen Mother does not recommend a free beer program for the poor or justify its use as an opiate for the masses. Her point is simply that the king must avoid drunkenness in order to reign properly. The comparison to the suffering poor and to their use of alcohol is meant to awaken Lemuel to the duties that go with his class and status rather than to describe some kind of permissible drunkenness. Again, medicinal purposes or even emotional purposes, according to Garrett, is not advocated. That's not the point. Duane Garrett says of what the author wrote. Alan Ross, drinking wine, craving beer is not for kings. If this literally prohibits any use of such drinks, it would be unheard of in the ancient court. So he advocates, this is the Expositor Bible commentary, said he advocates moderation. Colin Delage advocate moderation. John Phillips is the only one that would advocate total abstinence. And so here's my conclusion. The issue of abstinence or moderation cannot be settled from this passage. The issue is more clearly settled in the New Testament, at least for me. It is not for everybody. Of course, it's not clearly settled. That's why you have different views on moderation and total abstinence. But here's a blog post I wrote on this. Should believers be teetotalers, as we used to call them? And here's the men that would say yes. Total abstinence. John MacArthur, Norman Geisler, John Piper, Charles Ryrie. So you can read what I have to say there. And, of course, come to your own conclusions. Her advice, her example. Solomon gives us a choice of two roads. You remember, we know this. We've been emphasizing this all the way through our study of Proverbs that illustrate two lifestyles to travel in life. Well, he's bringing that conclusion, those analogies to a conclusion here. The road of the wise and the road of the fool. Of these two life journeys are contrasting traveling companions. On the road of the wise, the author here is going to conclude with the good wife, in contrast to the road of the fool that we have seen, the adulteress. Her advice we have looked at, now her example. Proverbs 31, 10-31 is an acrostic. Someone has said this is the ABCs of a virtuous woman. Some have even compared it to a checklist for bachelors. I mean, here is the ideal. Someone said this is not really the wisdom of Proverbs 31 woman, but the wisdom of the Proverbs 31 women. This is not a particular individual. This is a composite of the ideals of what makes up a godly wife and mother. And so it's a very high standard here. That's why I think sometimes on Mother's Day, when the pastor announces that he's going to preach on Proverbs 31, the mothers in the church sort of cringe. Oh no, I'm going to be expected to live this perfect life. It's held up as a model. It's sort of like the qualifications of 1 Timothy 3, 1-7 for pastors. Not soon angry, or not greedy of filthy lucre. Has any of us ever been angry? Has any of us ever been greedy? I think most of us will have to confess we have. But that is the standard that we should live for. We should not be characterized by anger, for sure. We should not be characterized by greed. And so I think we have an ideal here. Praise God for her character. So you can read these. These are your good commentaries are going to really explain these. Bible Knowledge Commentary, Thomas Constable. I would just look at these really good commentaries, and they will help you. But basically, the Proverbs 31 ideal wife mother here is praised for her character, for her hard work, and for her wise words. And then she is praised. So going back to the drunkenness issue, I was raised in the home of an alcoholic. Every night he would drink at least a 6-pack. That led to all kinds of issues with my mother, of course. My first drink was from a can of beer that my dad had. We were sitting at the kitchen table. He had his can of beer. He stepped out of the room, and I took my first drink. I mean, I've been around it nearly my whole life. And then that started me. That's where I started. Thankfully, I got saved, and it was over. But I just know the dangers of. That's why I hold to my position. Norman Geisler says in his writings on that 1 out of 10 social drinkers become alcoholics. That, to me, that's a big gamble. My advice is, if you never take your first drink, you'll never become an alcoholic. Just be safe. Why drinking anyway? Anyway, I know that's not the position of everyone. But then, now, contrast that with the virtuous woman. That would be my mother, okay? She's 96 years old. She's in a nursing home. In the last lesson, I talked about not being greedy with your parents. You remember that's what one of the numeric proverbs says. And yesterday, I went and visited my mother, my 96-year-old mother, in a nursing home. It was nice outside, about 70 degrees, and we went outside. I rolled her around the facilities, the grounds, in her wheelchair, and just had a great time. She says this to me: "You are my beloved son, in whom I am well pleased." And I thank God for that. But she was and is the virtuous woman. So what a contrast between the alcoholic father and the virtuous woman. The book of Proverbs ends up by giving us the wisdom of this godly example.